Now, my pleasure to welcome my colleague Wayne Cruz to the show. Wayne is the Fred L. Smith Jr. Fellow in Regulatory Studies here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Thanks for being with us, Wayne.
You bet. Happy to.
Now, a lot of people know you for the big annual report you've been producing for 25 plus years, 10,000 Commandments, an annual snapshot of the regulatory state. Give us a little background on that, and why did you start writing that?
Uh, I'll tell you, Richard, when I was in the 90s, I got interested in public policy. I was studying for an MBA. I thought I would go into banking or finance or something like that. And I got these messages in the mail from the Cato Institute and from the Institute for Humane Studies. And I wound up going to these summer seminars from both of them. And I kind of got bitten by the policy bug. I would see these professors who were making a living advocating for free markets. And here I was thinking of going into banking or something like that because I like business, you know. But what I realized was I was interested in the workings of business and free enterprise and capitalism as a whole, not for any particular company. And I started studying economics at George Mason University. I even had the chance to study under James Buchanan, the Nobel Prize winner, in an economic philosophy class. But at that time at George Mason, we had the Center for Study of Market Processes. We had the Center for Study of Public Choice at George Mason. I got extremely interested in it. I was looking for ways to what needs to happen. It's kind of what drives the way I think about policy now. What needs to happen next to advance liberty to the next level? You know, say we get 90% freedom, how do we work on the next 10%? What needs to happen next? Well, a lot of folks in the public policy world, by this time I had my eye on the think tanks too, were working on tax and budget issues. You know, a lot of groups were doing social issues and things like that. I got interested in the regulatory state, and studying in public choice was a perfect opportunity to do that because a lot of it was empirical. You'd look at the way states would change their policies and the effect that might have on growth and output. So I got interested in regulation. I ended up dropping out of graduate school. I got about to the master's level. I went to the Food and Drug Administration. I worked at Citizens for a Sound Economy, and I was looking for something to do. Everyone, you know, at that time it was, you know, Reagan and George Bush and Jim Miller at the time working on fiscal budget issues and carrying on about the debt and the need to reduce that. And I started thinking that the regulatory side of things needed measures and tabulations too. So I was putting together this report, and it had some boring title like, you know, regulatory trends 1982 to 1992, right? But there had been this book on antitrust, and sometimes I joke now that antitrust is like the original sin of the administrative state, but the book was called 10,000 Commandments, about the antitrust laws and the subjectivity of them. And so I took that title as kind of the lead in and started this report. I ended up working on the Hill and put it on hold for a while. But the first edition I did with the Chamber of Commerce. I did it early on with Citizens for a Sound Economy. When I came to CEI in '95, we put out the first edition with CEI, and it just sort of took off because it's like you get the historical tables for the budget, but there's nothing like that for the regulatory state, and that's sort of the gap that 10,000 Commandments was filling at the time. I would say that's brief, but that wasn't brief. But that you asked me that question, and I thought, you know, why did I do this anyway? Why am I still doing this? You said 25 years we've been doing this report. You guys are getting old. That's what I tell people.
These ideas are forever young. So every year when this comes out, we have the big headline figure for the annual cost of federal regulation, which, you know, these days is somewhere around $2 trillion, staggering amount. And that always gets a lot of attention because that's one little nugget people can latch onto. But you've also written about other undisclosed costs of regulation, including what you call like the meta costs of the administrative state and all these sort of secondary, downstream type of things. What all goes into that?
Well, the way I think about it is like we measure the cost of government in terms of spending, and we don't have those kinds of measures with respect to regulatory interventions. But we always say at CEI that if you're missing the regulatory state, you're missing probably the biggest part of the government's effect in the economy. We can look up the debt, we can look up the deficit. They may drive us crazy, but we can see what they are. It's not the same with regulation. You mentioned the 2 trillion figure. Well, we've been using that figure for years now. It's rooted in the early regulatory right to know legislation and the initial tabulations of the aggregate cost of regulation. Thomas Hopkins did it back at that time. OMB was interested in tracking regulatory costs. The Right to Know Act requires that aggregate estimates, and this is one of the furies I have going on now. They're required to do that estimate, but they abandoned it. They replaced it with a 10-year look back. Now they've even abandoned that since the Trump administration, and we're 4 years late on a cost benefit report from the Biden administration. So a lot goes into it. There's a lot that has to be tabulated just in terms of regulatory costs, let alone the hidden guidance documents and bulletins, notices, circulars, and all these sorts of things. So we need better tabulation of regulatory costs. The new 118th, I hope, will begin to tabulate will hold a series of hearings and require the OMB to look at regulatory costs and to track them. There are a lot of things that they can do in that respect, but bring back the costs of regulation reports that have lapsed in recent years and ensure that those are tabulated. But in addition to that, the guidance documents, which are increasingly important in terms of governance now, especially in the wake of the massive legislation that's been enacted the last few years, the CARES Act, the infrastructure law, the inflation bill, the CHIPS Act on innovation, all of these are extraordinarily regulatory just out from the get-go, just in terms of government spending, the procurement they entail, the contracting and so forth. So there's a fusion now of spending and regulation too. But what happens when you have those kinds of gargantuan laws governing the administrative state now is before business can move, it's almost got to get permission to do anything. Too many businesses now are shackled to the government by these laws. So that also makes it easier for the federal government to use guidance documents to direct policies and things like that. So we got, a handful of laws from Congress, a few thousand regulation, a lot more thousands of guidance documents, which become more pertinent the larger the federal government has become.
Yeah, and so those guidance documents are what you call the dark matter of government, where they're everywhere and they're difficult to measure, but they have a huge aggregate impact.
That's right. That caught on. You had under George Bush, you had recognition that guidance documents can be important too. Just as we have significant regulations, we can have significant guidance documents, and those entail a lot of things like waters of the United States, contracting categorizations for employees and things like that. There were disputes in the past in immigration and guidance documents being used to govern that. So there's a lot of ways that guidance documents come into play. And I think especially in high tech, they can matter a lot too. The FTC just put out a major guidance documents on dealing with monopolization issues, on how those will get classified. So it makes a big difference. And I think Congress will need to pay attention. The Trump administration had instructed agencies to put all of these things were hard to find. If you thought regulation was tough to deal with, guidance documents were scattered all over. No one knew where they were. No one knew how many there were. We still don't know how many they are. But Trump required agencies to set up a portal for their guidance documents. It just got put into play. I was able to, using kind of that framework, I was able to track down 80-some thousand guidance documents and list them on an informal portal. The Biden administration has ejected that. Despite that, though, I went back in this past year and I was able to tabulate over 107,000 guidance documents. Now, there are a lot more than that, but Biden has gotten rid of this, and I think it's very important. And we've had conversations with folks on the Hill, and I think we'll get some traction and take a look at some of the hidden regulatory costs. And there can be bipartisan interest in disclosure, and I was calling Biden the Edward Scissorhands of government disclosure because he's ripped up so many of these traditional ways that we would track regulation. But I think there is bipartisan interest in that. What really drives regulatory reform, though, we don't see it yet, We're not going to see it in the near future. But what really does drive it is when governors back in the States, when governors get ticked off and small business gets ticked off, we're seeing an escalation of mandates affecting local and state government. So I think we will see that pressure again. With small business, we're going to see that pressure again too, because guess what? Under Biden and just our recent look at the new unified agenda, regulations impacting small business are jumping up too, along with the economically significant rules. So we can start to see those pressures again, but we'll just have to keep an eye on things.
Now, the classical argument for government regulation in the first place is a market failure, the idea that the government has to step in and run things because markets can't function to provide whether it's public order or primary education or utility power, whatever it might be.
Right.
But you pointed out that a lot of types of regulations we have now are actually, in a way, doing the opposite. They're preempting market solutions that would have otherwise emerged. What kind of scenarios can we imagine where market discipline can replace political management?
Yeah, I think that's an important notion. You might have seen the headlines this morning that the FAA grounded all flights because of computer glitches shutting things down. You might recall 2 years ago, we had the Colonial Pipeline shut down. Only a single pipeline serving the East Coast. How many pipelines have we built since then? None. So I think there's when you talk about market failure, that is the classic justification for regulation, whether you're talking about a public good issue or whether you're talking about pollution, or if the claim is, well, one business can't do it alone or doesn't have the profit incentive to do take on a certain role. So government has to step in. Here's the problem I have with that. Usually, we already have now in the new unified agenda, just for example, 69 federal regulatory agencies. They tend to jump in immediately into any new technology, and new technologies and sectors get born captive. That's artificial intelligence, digital currencies, and so forth down the road. I think what policymakers should do is recognize that it's usually not market failure that's our actual problem. It's a political failure, or as Fred would always say, a failure to have markets. Rather than market failure, there's a failure to have markets. And he had a quote that's been one of my favorites, but the progressives were geniuses in the sense that of major complicated assets that should have been subjected or brought into the property rights sphere and the free market ownership sphere, airsheds, watersheds, and so forth, were put in the government sphere over 100 years ago, and that's where they remain. So if you have government controlling airspace and divvying up airspace for planes like the ones that were shut down today, naturally, when drones come along, guess what the geniuses, the experts do? They try to put the drones right into that same 80-year-old FAA airspace. So what I would jokingly call it an office of no, but I'm very serious about it. I think for every regulation, whether you're talking economic, health and safety, and so on down the line, there should be an entity within the government. It's certainly not OMB anymore that's supposed to review regulation, but there should be an entity that says, wait a minute, let's monitor this and make sure that we're not classifying something as market failure when it's really a political failure and a failure to define property rights. And over time, let's move this regulatory control out of the federal government and into the private sector where it belongs. Instead, we're doing a lot of the opposite with the infrastructure law, the CHIPS Act, and so forth. Everything now from tap water at the local level to space commercialization is being treated as a government-private partnership, when instead it should be fully private. But privatization has kind of left the libertarian lexicon lately. I think we've got to really, really amp that up, especially in the wake of these new laws, as I said, are going to lead to a lot of governance of these important sectors just by guidance documents. So that's the real essence of it. It's not so much that market failure was ever our problem. It's certainly less of our problem as technology advances, and technology enables us to make those public goods private ones, so to speak. But it's much simpler now, and it's much more of an important task to make sure that we don't let political failure that's really taking place instead be excused as market failure.
Right. Speaking of political failure, one of the themes we've talked about recently on the show, and it's become more popular among policy nerds, is the idea of the abundance agenda. The idea that reforming existing policies can increase supplies of market goods like housing, energy, healthcare.
Yeah.
And this seems to line up with something, one of your recent columns at Forbes, the one titled "Abolish Antitrust to Expand Private Infrastructure and Supply Chains." How does that kind of idea of an abundance agenda line up with the work you've been doing?
Well, very much. I think in a way, that's almost like the goal of it. I think we sometimes when there's a crisis, we say, well, liberate to stimulate rather than do more regulation and more spending to stimulate. This country, the United States, became the richest country on earth before we had an income tax, before we had this administrative state, before we had the antitrust laws. We became the wealthiest nation. And so I think you can tell just from that alone that the source of prosperity is not the federal government. And everyone who gets involved in the libertarian movement makes the point, well, when government spends, it's just taking from the private sector. I think a part of it is, I would say, if you're trying to liberate and advance a growth agenda, what do you do when you're stuck like we are now with the federal government that's 31 trillion in debt and spending 6 trillion a year and has just allocated to itself massive power over the all of the future infrastructures that are to develop? We are really in a bind with that. And it was easier to say 5 years ago before CARES Act. But some of what you do is you wall off the future from the regulatory state. You say, okay, we're going to make sure that new technologies, new advances, new discoveries, new networks are not brought into the government sphere, but are left alone. We do the opposite there. But we'd always joke, you don't have to tell the grass to grow, just take the rocks off of it. But I think that's a big important part of it. Now the spending state and the regulatory state are fused to a great deal. So I think a big part of our goal, and I had addressed some of this in a recent notion in the wake of the COVID crisis. I called it abuse of crisis prevention, because what you have seen, not just in this century, but the COVID crisis was the third of the 21st century. We had 9/11, we had the financial meltdown, and then we had CARES Act. Each time, Richard, each time one of those has occurred, the response has been a major escalation in government spending, government programs, and government regulations. That's always been the response. And so far, we're not inoculated against that yet. I mean, we're trying to communicate to the 118th Congress, okay, great that you've done all these rule changes and you've taken some steps that are going to require Congress to take more control over what agencies do. But they're going to be caught flat-footed again if there's another economic shock. So when we're talking about a growth agenda, like you mentioned, we've got to deal with the existing regulatory state and spending state and reduce those and have a vision for that. I mean, we don't have enough time to talk about that, but libertarians certainly have the kind of vision of that, what government should do. I always joke, pick a national bird, but other than that, kind of leave us alone. But a serious agenda for reducing the growth of government. Part of it is the privatization that I was mentioning earlier. But the thing that worries me the most, and we could advance that kind of thing, but at the instant there's another shock, you have both parties jumping in and doing major interventions.
Well, yeah, it seems like we have, historically, like as described in a book like Crisis and Leviathan, you have this political theory that a wartime creates more powers for the government, and you get this sort of one-way ratchet where the government always gets bigger, but then it never goes back to as small as it was before that. And more powers and more spending is always a classic example of that. But as you pointed out, and maybe 9/11 does fit in that category, but we have other civilian crises that have created the same effect, the same ratchet effect. So rather than having a short-term emergency power to address only the current emergency, we have a long-term permanent expansion of the bureaucracy for the indefinite future.
Well, just think how difficult it is to do a rollback, even when something is achieved by, say the left makes an achievement like Obamacare, for example. The Republicans for years after that said, "Oh, abolish Obamacare, abolish Obamacare." Well, now there's no speaking of that at all. The last time you had the Republicans talk about abolishing actual agencies and departments was back in a significant way, was around the era when Gingrich was doing the contract with America and so forth. Shortly after that, you had John Kasich with a program to abolish the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, and the Department of Commerce. You hear little peeps about this occasionally, since that time, but it would usually tamp out pretty quick. That was attempted back then. It went away. No one breathes it now. Even in the Trump administration, when he was doing the 1 in, 2 out, alongside that, a lot of people have forgotten this, he also had an executive branch restructuring program. And the idea there was to see what agencies you can get rid of. We're talking about ratcheting up. And here's Trump, who's supposedly the biggest reformer of regulatory reformer since Reagan. Even under the Trump administration, when they put out their big report on streamlining, getting rid of redundant programs and duplication and overlap, all they really did was do a little bit of a merger between some Department of Labor programs and Department of Education programs, but not get rid of either department. So you see the hurdles for the libertarian movement. You can talk about getting rid of these agencies, but there needs to be a clear agenda for what the alternative is. Part of the answer to that goes back to your earlier raising the questions about what are really market failures and what are really political failures, and what's the distinction, as Fred would always point out too, between political discipline and competitive does, and then create an agency named after it, or create an agency and expect that is actually doing regulation.
Now, Wayne, one thing that you've always said that I've been fascinated by is this idea, and this is sort of a paraphrase, you can correct me here, that most of the businesses that will ever exist haven't been created yet. Most of the wealth that will ever exist hasn't been earned yet. What does that kind of understanding mean for making economic policy in the future?
I'm glad you brought that up, because it's certainly true. Our lives are pretty short. We live 78, and that's it. And our descendants come along and carry things on. So part of the solution to advancing a free market, advancing a libertarian type of vision, is recognizing that we're not here forever, and we can lay groundwork and leave a better future. A lot of that is what had driven my interest in putting together this notion of an Abusive Crisis Prevention Act. The way to make society resilient and ensure that tomorrow's businesses are freer and tomorrow's jobs are more abundant is making sure that the federal government doesn't continue to grow, and to make sure that instead of advancing intergenerational debt like we're doing, intergenerational federal debt, we're instead advancing intergenerational wealth at the personal, family, community, local, state level, and having that supersede and replace the federal government. So in the abusive crisis notion, and it kind of goes back to the fusion of spending and regulation now, there needs to be like what you think about, well, what is the doomsday prepper responsibility of the household, of the community, of the locality, of the state, before the federal government jumps in with massive new programs. And part of that is tax reforms to let individuals and families keep more of their earnings. Part of it is changing the retirement system so that people can, instead of a child who's born paying into Social Security, instead he sets aside an annuity at the very beginning, keeps his wealth, and then has something that can be transferred for intergenerational wealth. So it's a lot of elements like that would be involved. But you can certainly use just the fact of our limited existence as a way of a freer economy, and making sure that people government in the future.
Now, you mentioned our good friend and venerable founder, Fred. And Fred Smith, of course, is the founder of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and you recently named the Fred L. Smith Jr. Fellow in Regulatory Studies. Can you tell us a little bit about Fred and his approach to public policy, and why his name is apparently now on your business card?
That's a long title for the business card, but I've admired Fred for so many years. I thought his vision was so unique when I first met him. I was at Citizens for a sound economy. And I remember we were having an evening function and Fred came in with Sam Kasman. And I was so attracted by this notion that it's the regulatory state that is what needs to be addressed if we're going to advance free enterprise. And Fred had this exciting notion of freeing up the economy and freeing up innovation and making all these opportunities available for the public. You might remember he was on the Bill Moyers show, and he talked about, well, we dance with corporations, but we don't get married. And I thought that's kind of the approach, because remember when I met Fred, that was at a time when I was thinking about going into business or banking or something like that. But I had this interest in the broader advancement of the free economy. And Fred, for me, just embodied that with all the enthusiasm that he had. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly right. We're trying to advance the markets, but we don't necessarily care about a particular corporation, because guess what? We work on a lot of public policy issues, but companies who like what we do have other issues where they disagree with us. And that's across the board. Every company that anybody in the free market community has areas where they disagree. But on areas where you can advance the vision, I think it's really important. But at what other groups are doing on the public policy side, and the vision of freeing up infrastructures and freeing technologies and making sure that the future isn't born captive to the state is very, very unique to Fred. Because when Fred talked about free markets and airsheds and property rights and water rights and airsheds, he was serious. He meant that. But those have been dropped for 100 years by the movement. And I hope that we continue to advance those kinds of ideas, because we're in a situation now where the federal government owns most of the Western states. The federal government's going to be in control of commercial space exploration, even if you can call it a partnership, but it's the federal government heavily involved, and all of that should change. And all of the problems, so many of the problems we face, like environmental problems that get blamed on the private sector, a lot of that is rooted in failure to have markets. Again, it's political control of resources, which leads to scarcity, leads to pollution. So all of those things that motivated Fred still motivate this organization. And I still see CEI as completely unique in the vision that it advances to make those changes. Puts us on the edge, and I love that. That's what I love. Fred was not interested in good government. He was, he called it goo-goo. He wasn't interested in just good government, but saying, well, maybe on this environmental issue, this public health issue, or this economic intervention issue, maybe the government shouldn't be involved at all, and maybe we should be looking at returning the discipline to the competitive sector, the private sector, the voluntary sector.
Well, yeah. Well, I know that just leaves the easy part, which is the solution to all of these problems. So you mentioned a few things: administrative reforms, certainly just disclosing, cataloging, being transparent about how many rules and regulations there actually are, some estimate of what they cost. But of course, we've also got the possibility that hopefully Congress could do something about this, and certainly you've written about potential solutions, things like the REINS Act, getting Congress to vote on big major proposed regulations. What do you think are the most promising avenues forward in that area?
Yes. Yeah. Well, as it stands, the 118th Congress, there's not anything on a major regulatory reform front that would get through the Senate and that would be signed by Biden. But what we can do is hold a series of exploratory hearings in the Judiciary Committee and Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and lay some groundwork for reforms and legislation that we know are good. They're not going to be the ultimate change reforms that we need, that you're getting at, that really motivate me. But we've already had introduced this week a new version of the Article 1 Regulatory Budgeting Act. There's something called the Alert Act, which is something we've pushed for a long time. It's kind of a report card. It's, in addition to regulatory costs, it's also would force agencies to disclose where they didn't do regulatory costs. And so when they make the claims of the overall benefits of the regulatory state, we say, oh no, you actually have not done benefits for 99% of the regulatory state, which is actually where things stand. So you can lay that kind of groundwork. I do think that we can monitor the circumstances as we hold oversight hearings for OMB and such, but we can potentially get through some disclosure-oriented regulation reforms. Because believe it or not, something called the GOOD Act, Guidance Out of Darkness, which would require the disclosure of guidance documents on a website. Even Kamala Harris, as a California senator, had co-sponsored that legislation. So it's possible that you can have some bipartisan reform. I do think, as I mentioned before, that it's going to take the state and small business speaking up, but we have to be careful too in the notion that it's not going to be, especially given the size of the federal government now. You know, it brags on the small business website of being the largest purchaser of goods and services on planet Earth. That ought to alarm us rather than make us say, wow. And it's the biggest employer in the United States. That gives it extraordinary heft. If the shoe were on the other foot, they would be accusing the private sector of monopsony or monopsony power. But that gives the federal government extraordinary heft in employment, in contracting, in procurement to drive the private sector. So that's one of the things to look out for. But also, we could do massive regulatory reforms in terms of cost benefit analyses, even the REINS Act requiring Congress to approve major regulations or complicated ones, which I think it should extend to that too. But Richard, the big problem we have to confront now is it's not just the administrative state, but it's Congress itself that is exercising too much power. In the CARES Act, and you saw what that did. It was bad. It was bad enough that, say, Trump did the eviction moratorium and then Biden tried to extend it. That's bad. But what's worse is that Congress had put that in the legislation in the first place. That's what's worse. So we can't lose sight of that. Congress doing the infrastructure bill that gets the federal government involved, like I said, everything from space down to tap water. Congress did that. It wasn't the agencies doing that. So we got to be wide awake and recognize that all the administrative state reforms that I've spent my career on are necessary, but not sufficient. We've also got to address Congress itself doing too much and giving agencies too much power. I mean, it's Congress that did the Dodd-Frank legislation. It's Congress that did CARES, Congress that did the Department of Homeland Security. You know, we can talk about streamlining or going after the Transportation Security Administration, things like that. But Congress did that. And that's what we really, really have to confront in addressing the regulatory state. It's government as such that's doing too many things.
All right. Well, it sounds like we got a lot of work to do. So, well, thanks, Wayne. You can, of course, find Wayne and his delightful insightful writing at cei.org, at Forbes.com, at Twitter at Wayne_Cruz and 10KC. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks for being with us, Wayne.
You bet. It's my pleasure. Anytime. Let's talk about dark matter when we do that new report soon.
All right.